On my 73rd birthday, my son-in-law called me with a warning that would blow my entire world apart. He told me not to come home. He told me to disappear. I had a feeling something was terribly wrong, but I stayed silent and did not ask a single question. Instead, I quietly moved my entire $7 million fortune into a secured trust. The next morning, when my daughter showed up at my motel door, I was left speechless, and I finally understood everything. If you are watching this, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what city you are listening from. Now take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you will make you question the people closest to you. It was 6 o'clock in the evening, and the Seattle rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets. The massive drops hammered against the steel roof of my Ford truck, and the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers was the only sound keeping me company on the dark highway. I was exactly 73 years old that day. My hands gripping the worn leather of the steering wheel were thick-scarred and deeply calloused from 40 years of grueling work in commercial construction. I had spent my entire adult life building office complexes, shopping centers, and warehouses from the ground up across Washington state. I knew how to pour concrete, how to lay steel, and more importantly, how to read people. Hard work and a ruthless attention to detail had built me a very comfortable life. It was a life where my bank accounts held over $7 million in liquid cash and assets. But as any old man will tell you, a fat bank account does not keep you warm at night. Since my beloved wife Caroline passed away 5 years ago, my big house had felt empty, echoing with ghosts and memories. That is exactly why I was actually looking forward to this rainy evening. My only daughter, Rachel, had insisted on hosting a special birthday dinner for me at my own house. She told me she was taking the afternoon off from her high-stress job as a corporate executive to cook my favorite roast. She even said she had invited a few of my oldest friends from the construction business. I had spent my afternoon picking up a nice bottle of red wine and a custom chocolate cake from the local bakery down the street. Sitting on the passenger seat next to me, that cake felt like a symbol of a family that was still holding together. I was just a tired father, eager to see his daughter and give a big hug to his 5-year-old grandson. I thought I was driving toward a night of warmth, laughter, and celebration. I had absolutely no idea I was driving directly into a carefully laid trap. I was about 3 miles away from my neighborhood, just taking the final highway exit, when my phone rang. The glowing screen on my dashboard lit up the dark cabin with the name Derek. Derek was my son-in-law. He was a quiet, mild-mannered guy who worked in the tech industry. He was a good father, but he was always completely overshadowed by Rachel. My daughter was a force of nature, always commanding the room, always making the decisions. Derek was the one who sat in the corner and played with the kids. Because of this dynamic, Derek rarely ever called me directly. Usually, if they needed something, Rachel was the one to pick up the phone and bark orders. I tapped the screen to answer, fully expecting him to ask me to pick up some extra ice or maybe some paper towels on my way home. I smiled into the dark cabin and said, "Hey Derek, I am just a few minutes away. I have the cake. See you guys soon." But there was no cheerful greeting on the other end of the line. There was no background noise of a kitchen preparing for a party. There was only heavy, frantic breathing. Then a voice that sounded so absolutely terrified it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight. He was whispering as if he was hiding in a closet. He said, "Dad, listen to me very carefully. Do not come home tonight. Whatever you do, turn your truck around right now." I frowned, my foot instinctively hovering over the brake pedal. My first thought was that there had been a fire or maybe a medical emergency with my grandson. But before I could even get a single word out to ask what was wrong, Derek spoke again. His voice was trembling so hard I could barely make out the words over the sound of the rain. He said, "Go to a hotel, go anywhere else. Turn off your phone location immediately. Please, Dad. Just trust me. Do not come home." And then the line went dead. The sudden heavy silence in the cabin of my truck was deafening. The call had lasted barely 15 seconds, but it shifted the axis of my entire universe. An ordinary man, a softer man, might have immediately called back. He might have panicked, slammed his foot on the gas pedal, and rushed home to demand answers. He might have convinced himself it was just a bad prank or a strange misunderstanding. But I did not survive 4 decades in the cutthroat, unforgiving world of commercial contracting by ignoring my gut instincts. When a supplier tries to screw you over, you do not yell. You observe, you gather your resources, and you protect your assets. And right now, every single instinct in my body, honed over 73 years of life, was screaming at me that I was in severe danger. I took my foot completely off the accelerator. I guided my heavy truck off the main road, pulling into the empty, poorly lit parking lot of a closed-down diner. I put the truck in park and left the engine running. I sat there in the dark shadows, the rain washing violently over the windshield, replaying Derek's panicked words in my head over and over again. Turn off your phone location. That was the specific piece of the puzzle that triggered every alarm bell in my mind. You only tell someone to turn off their location tracking if they are being actively hunted, if someone is watching their every move. My own daughter Rachel had set up my new smartphone for me a few months ago. She had insisted we share our GPS locations with each other at all times, claiming it was for my own safety since I lived alone. I had thought it was a sweet gesture from a caring daughter. Now I realized that very feature was a leash, and she was holding the other end. My hands did not shake. My heart beat in a steady, slow rhythm. The grandfather in me wanted to rush to my family and protect them, but the survivor in me took complete control. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not text Derek back. I did not call Rachel. I went straight into the system settings, found the location services, and disabled them. Then I held down the power button until the screen faded to pitch black. I was completely off the grid. The birthday dinner was a lie. The only question now was what kind of nightmare my daughter had waiting for me at that house and how I was going to crush it. The rain continued to batter the roof of my truck with a relentless fury. I sat in the cold, damp shadows of the abandoned diner parking lot, letting the reality of the situation settle into my bones. My daughter was tracking me. My son-in-law was terrified, and I was supposed to be walking into a birthday surprise. Instead of reaching for the ignition, I reached deep into the hidden compartment beneath my center console. My fingers brushed past old toll receipts and a spare flashlight, until they found the small, heavy rectangle of my prepaid emergency phone. It was an old habit from my days running massive construction sites. When you are dealing with millions of dollars in materials, union disputes, and unpredictable contractors, you learn to keep a secure line of communication that nobody else knows about. I bought this phone years ago, keeping it charged and hidden strictly for absolute emergencies. I never thought the emergency would involve my own flesh and blood. I powered the device on. The screen cast a harsh, pale blue light across my calloused hands. I punched in a number I knew by heart, a number belonging to a man who had been my shield in the business world for over 3 decades. Mitchell Gallagher was not just a lawyer. He was a shark. He was the kind of attorney who wore bespoke suits, charged an exorbitant hourly rate, and could dismantle a hostile corporate takeover before his morning coffee. Mitchell and I had fought side by side in boardrooms and courtrooms, crushing crooked developers and protecting the empire I had built. I knew he was attending a high society dinner party tonight, but I also knew he would answer my call. The phone rang twice. Then a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the static. Mitchell answered with his usual impatience. He said, "Richard, my friend, tell me someone is suing you because the string quartet at this gala is putting me to sleep." I did not laugh. I kept my voice low, steady, and devoid of any emotion. I said, "Mitchell, step away from the party. Go somewhere completely quiet. I need your undivided attention right now." There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the faint clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of polite conversation fade away as Mitchell walked down a hallway. The sound of a heavy door clicking shut echoed through the speaker. His tone shifted instantly from playful to dead serious. He said, "I am in a private study. The door is locked. What is wrong?" I laid out the facts exactly as they had happened. I told him about the birthday dinner, the sudden phone call from Derek, and the chilling instruction to turn off my location services. I explained that Rachel had insisted on installing that tracking software on my personal phone months ago. Mitchell listened without interrupting. In our 30 years of friendship, he had learned that I never panicked over shadows. If I said there was a threat, there was a threat. When I finished speaking, a heavy silence stretched across the line. Mitchell let out a slow, calculated breath. He said, "Derek is a coward, Richard. If a man like Derek is risking his own neck to warn you to stay away from your own house, Rachel has orchestrated something massive. And given her position in the corporate world, this is not a personal dispute. This is a calculated strategic strike. And a strike like that is always about the money." He was right. It was always about the money. We both knew exactly what was at stake. After my wife Caroline passed away, I had liquidated a significant portion of my commercial real estate portfolio. I wanted a simpler life. That liquidation had left me with exactly $7 million in pure liquid cash and easily accessible assets sitting comfortably under my name. At the time Caroline passed, Mitchell had drafted a comprehensive legal fortress for me. We had established an irrevocable trust. It was designed to protect my wealth from lawsuits, creditors, and any potential predators. The paperwork was entirely finalized, signed, and legally binding. The trust was essentially a massive, impenetrable vault. The only thing missing was the money. We had never actually transferred the $7 million into it, because doing so meant I would surrender direct personal ownership of those funds. I stared out the rain-streaked windshield into the black night. I said, "Mitchell, I want to execute the safe harbor protocol. I want the trust activated, and I want every single cent of that $7 million moved into it tonight." I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Mitchell was a man who thrived on aggressive legal maneuvers, but even he knew the magnitude of what I was asking. He said, "Richard, listen to me very carefully. The banks are closed, but I have the emergency routing authorizations we signed 3 years ago. I can make the digital transfers through my private wealth contacts. But you need to understand the absolute finality of this action. If I pull this trigger tonight, that money is completely gone from your name." Mitchell continued, his voice dropping an octave. He said, "Once those funds cross the threshold into the irrevocable trust, you are no longer the legal owner of $7 million. You will be a beneficiary, but you cannot simply withdraw it to buy a car or write a check. It becomes legally untouchable. If we do this and it turns out tomorrow morning that Derek was just being paranoid, or that Rachel was planning a surprise vacation instead of an ambush, you cannot just undo this. The legal process to reverse an irrevocable trust transfer is a nightmare that could take years and cost you a fortune in court fees. It is a one-way street. Are you completely certain?" I said, "Do it." I put the truck in drive and pulled out of the diner parking lot, leaving my birthday dinner behind me. I drove for another 20 miles down the slick, rain-washed highway until I found what I was looking for. It was a nameless, run-down motel with a flickering neon vacancy sign that cast a yellow glow over the asphalt. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions as long as you paid in cash up front. I walked into the cramped lobby, handed the tired-looking clerk a $50 bill, and took the rusty key to room 12. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine disinfectant. The floral bedspread was faded, and the single lamp on the nightstand flickered when I turned it on. It was a far cry from the immaculate home I had lived in for 30 years, but tonight this dingy room was my fortress. I locked the deadbolt, fastened the security chain, and pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, opened my briefcase, and pulled out my laptop. I booted up the computer and connected to a mobile hotspot I kept for traveling. The screen illuminated the dark room as I logged into the encrypted portal Mitchell had set up for me years ago. My burner phone buzzed against the nightstand. It was Mitchell confirming he was ready on his end. Over the next 3 hours, my attorney and I worked in methodical silence, communicating only when necessary to confirm routing numbers and digital signatures. The safe harbor clause was a complex legal mechanism. It required multiple layers of authorization, biometric verifications, and cryptographic keys to move that kind of capital outside of banking hours. I watched the screen as the balances of my lifetime of labor were queued up for transfer. Checking accounts, high-yield savings mutual funds, and liquid stock portfolios. $7,214,680. It was everything I had bled for on construction sites since I was 20 years old. Mitchell spoke quietly through the phone. He told me to type in my final authorization code. My thick, calloused finger hovered over the keyboard. Once I pressed enter, I would technically be a man with 0 assets to my name. The irrevocable trust would own it all, managed by a neutral third-party institution governed by strict rules that not even I could alter. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and pressed the enter key. The screen buffered for a moment. Then a green confirmation box appeared. The accounts read 0. The money was gone, safely locked away in the impenetrable vault of the trust. Mitchell let out a heavy sigh and told me he would see me in the morning. He hung up the phone, leaving me alone in the silence of room 12. I closed the laptop and lay back on the bed, fully clothed, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. The adrenaline that had fueled me for the past 4 hours began to drain away, replaced by a cold, heavy knot of doubt in the pit of my stomach. In the quiet isolation of the cheap motel room, the mind starts to play cruel tricks. I began to wonder if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. I had just financially severed myself based on a 15-second phone call from a son-in-law who was known to be anxious. What if Derek had just been having a panic attack? What if he and Rachel had simply gotten into a marital argument and he was projecting his fear onto me? My mind raced back to my daughter. I remembered teaching Rachel how to ride a bicycle in our driveway. I remembered the fierce, proud look on her face when she graduated with her finance degree. Could the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read her bedtime stories be capable of plotting against me? Had my decades in the ruthless construction business made me paranoid? Perhaps the tracking application really was just her way of making sure an old man did not get lost. Perhaps she really was at my house right now, standing next to a chocolate cake, wondering why her father had abandoned her on his day. The wave of guilt was agonizing. It gnawed at my chest, making it hard to breathe in the stale air of the room. I had disinherited her, at least temporarily, without even giving her a chance to explain her side of the story. I closed my eyes, praying to my late wife Caroline for guidance, asking her out loud if I was slowly going insane, if I had just destroyed our family over a phantom threat that did not exist. Sleep finally took me, pulling me down into a dark, restless, nightmare-filled exhaustion. But the fragile peace did not last long. I was jolted awake by a sound that shook the very walls of the cheap motel room. It was a heavy pounding on the wooden door. I sat straight up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Pale morning light was bleeding through the edges of the blackout curtains. The digital clock on the nightstand read 7:15. The knocking came again, louder this time. I walked slowly toward the door, holding my breath, and pressed my eye against the glass of the peephole. My blood ran completely cold. Standing on the exterior walkway, her face buried in her hands, was my daughter Rachel. She was sobbing hysterically, her shoulders shaking with apparent grief. But it was not her tears that made my stomach drop into my shoes. It was the 2 men standing directly behind her. They were both large, imposing, and dressed in full tactical police uniforms, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy leather utility belts. Before I could even process the shock of seeing the police, Rachel lunged forward. She threw her arms around my neck, burying her face into my chest, sobbing with a theatrical desperation that belonged on a movie screen. "Oh, Daddy, thank God we found you," she cried out, her voice echoing down the concrete walkway. "I was so terrified. You forgot your way home again, did you not?" I stood frozen in the doorway, feeling the cold morning air wash over me. Over Rachel's trembling shoulder, I locked eyes with the two police officers. They were built like linebackers, their hands resting deliberately near their duty weapons. They looked at me not with suspicion, but with that unbearable heavy pity reserved for the helpless and the broken. In a fraction of a second, the architecture of her trap became crystal clear in my mind. I had turned off the location tracking on my smartphone, but I had completely forgotten about the GPS anti-theft system hardwired into the dashboard of my truck. She had not needed my phone to find me. She simply tracked the vehicle. And now she had brought the authorities armed with a fabricated narrative that I was a wandering dementia-ridden old man who was a danger to himself. The sheer brilliance and cruelty of her plan struck me like a physical blow. If I reacted the way any normal, sane man would in this situation, I would lose everything. If I pushed her away, if I shouted that she was a liar, if I tried to explain to the police that my daughter was setting me up for a financial slaughter, I would look like a paranoid, combative, delusional senior citizen. The officers would see an aggressive man suffering from cognitive decline, who was resisting the loving care of his distressed daughter. They would likely restrain me, place me under a temporary psychiatric hold, and deliver me right into the medical and legal nightmare she had waiting for me. I had spent my life as a fighter, but standing in that doorway, I realized that fighting with my temper would only tighten the noose around my neck. To win this war, I had to become exactly what she claimed I was. I had to surrender my pride and put on the performance of my life. I forced the tension out of my muscles. I let my shoulders slump forward, instantly shaving an inch off my height. I relaxed my jaw, allowing my mouth to hang open just slightly, and I let my eyes drift from the sharp, focused gaze of a contractor to the cloudy, unfocused stare of a man lost in the fog of his own failing mind. I raised my hands slowly, making them tremble just a little, and awkwardly patted Rachel on the back. "There now, sweetie," I mumbled, pitching my voice slightly higher and weaker than normal. "There is no need to cry. I was just taking a little rest. It was raining so hard, and the roads looked so unfamiliar. I think I just took a wrong turn after the bakery." Rachel pulled back her eyes, red and puffy, playing the role of the exhausted caregiver perfectly. She looked back at the officers, wiping a tear from her cheek. "You see what I mean," she said to them softly. "He was supposed to come straight to my house for his birthday dinner last night. He has been getting worse these past few weeks, but he has never wandered off like this before. I have the medical evaluation scheduled for tomorrow, but when he did not come home, I thought he might have driven into the river." The taller of the two officers stepped forward, his posture relaxing as he assessed the situation. He saw an old, confused man in a cheap motel room, yielding peacefully to his daughter. The threat level dropped to 0. He gave me a gentle, reassuring smile. "It happens to the best of us, sir," the officer said, speaking to me slowly and loudly, the way you would address a toddler. "The weather was terrible last night. You did the right thing by pulling over and getting a room. But your family was very worried about you. We need to get you back home where it is safe." I nodded slowly, looking down at my shoes, as if I was ashamed of my own confusion. "I am sorry to cause such a fuss, officer," I said, keeping my voice frail and uncertain. "I just wanted to bring the chocolate cake. I bought a cake for the party, but I could not find the right exit." The second officer tipped his hat, his eyes filled with genuine sympathy. "Do not worry about the cake, sir," he said softly. "Your daughter is just glad you are safe. Let us get your things packed up. We will follow you both back to the house to make sure everything is settled." Rachel stepped into the room, quickly grabbing my small overnight bag and my laptop case. I felt a spike of adrenaline, when she touched the laptop, knowing it held the digital footprint of the $7 million transfer I had executed just hours ago. But she did not open it. She was too focused on maintaining her act in front of the police. She linked her arm tightly through mine, gripping me with a hidden strength that felt like a handcuff. "Let us go home, Daddy," she whispered, her voice laced with a sickening sweetness. We walked slowly out of the motel room and down the concrete path toward the parking lot. The rain had stopped, but the morning air was cold and damp. As we rounded the corner of the building, I saw Rachel's large black SUV idling in the lot. Standing next to the passenger door, gripping the handle with white knuckles, was Derek. He looked absolutely awful. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he looked as though he was going to be physically sick right there on the asphalt. When he saw me walking toward him arm in arm with the woman who was orchestrating my demise, his eyes widened in sheer terror. He knew I had received his warning. He knew I had turned off my phone. And yet here I was, walking willingly into the trap he had risked everything to warn me about. He looked at me, begging for a sign, searching for any indication that I had a plan. But with the police officers walking closely behind us, I could not give him one. I simply kept my shoulders slumped, maintained my blank, confused stare, and shuffled slowly toward the car, ready to step inside the belly of the beast. Derek opened the heavy back door of the SUV for us, his eyes glued to the wet pavement. He did not say a word as I climbed into the back seat, moving with an exaggerated stiffness that I hoped looked like the frailty of old age. Rachel slid in right beside me, practically pressing her side against mine to ensure I had no room to maneuver. The leather seats were cold, and the air conditioning hummed quietly, chilling the damp fabric of my jacket. Through the tinted windows, I watched the two police officers climb back into their cruiser. They flashed their lights, once a silent signal that they would be following us closely to ensure the poor, confused old man made it safely back to his residence. As Derek put the car in drive and pulled out of the motel parking lot, the heavy silence inside the cabin was suffocating. I kept my hands resting weakly on my lap, staring blankly at the back of the passenger seat. Rachel reached over and grabbed my right hand. Her fingers were manicured, her grip tight and possessive. She began stroking my knuckles with her thumb, in a rhythm that was meant to look soothing, but felt distinctly like a threat. "Are you feeling a little better now, Daddy?" she asked, her voice dripping with that sickening maternal condescension. "You gave us such a terrible fright last night. You really must stop trying to drive in the rain. We are going to have to talk to the doctor about taking your keys away just to keep you safe from yourself." I did not look at her. I just gave a slow, vacant nod, letting my chin rest near my chest. "Okay, sweetie," I murmured softly. "Whatever you think is best." It took every ounce of self-control I had built over a lifetime not to pull my hand away and tell her exactly what I thought of her performance. The audacity of her lies was breathtaking. Here she was, my own flesh and blood, calmly discussing stripping away my independence while the police escorted us from behind. I realized then that she had been planning this for months. Every time she had gently corrected my memory about a minor detail, every time she had offered to handle a confusing piece of mail. It had all been groundwork for this very moment. She was building a medical history piece by piece, painting a portrait of a father who could no longer manage his own affairs. I shifted my gaze slightly upward, lifting my eyes just enough to look into the rearview mirror. Derek was staring right back at me. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the steering wheel, and a small bead of sweat was tracing its way down his temple despite the cool air in the cabin. He looked trapped. When our eyes met in the reflection of the glass, I saw a profound, desperate apology swimming in his expression. I gave him absolutely nothing in return. I kept my face slack, my jaw slightly parted, maintaining the illusion of the dementia patient. But Derek knew. He had made that phone call. He knew I had the capacity to understand the warning. As we waited at a red light, Derek gave a slow, microscopic shake of his head. It was barely a tremor, a movement so slight that Rachel sitting right next to me completely missed it. but I caught it. That tiny gesture spoke volumes. It told me that whatever was waiting for me at the house was worse than just a forced retirement. It told me that Derek was not the architect of this nightmare, but a hostage to it. He was a man backed into a corner, forced to play chauffeur, to his wife's treachery, likely paralyzed by some leverage she held over him. I filed that realization away. If Derek was a victim in this, he could also be an asset. The rain began to fall again as we entered my neighborhood, washing over the manicured lawns and familiar brick houses I had known for 30 years. I had poured the concrete for the sidewalks on this very street when it was first developed. I knew every crack in the pavement. Yet riding in the back of this dark SUV, being escorted by the police like a prisoner of war, the neighborhood felt entirely alien. Rachel patted my hand again as we turned the final corner. We drove slowly past the massive oak tree I had planted when she was just a little girl. My stomach tightened as the house came into view. The driveway was empty, but the front porch light was glaring, cutting through the gloomy morning mist. Derek smoothly steered the heavy vehicle up the driveway and put it in park. The engine cut off, leaving only the sound of the rain drumming against the roof. The police cruiser pulled up to the curb behind us, idling patiently. Rachel turned to me, her fake smile widening, showing her teeth. She leaned in close, the scent of her expensive perfume overpowering the smell of the damp car interior. She squeezed my hand one last time and whispered in a voice that was both sweet and laced with pure poison. "We are home now, and we have a surprise for you inside to keep you safe, Daddy." I just stared blankly at the front door of my own brick home. My sanctuary had been invaded and turned into a holding cell. The heavy wooden door, the one I had carved and hung with my own 2 hands decades ago, now looked like the entrance to a nightmare. I swallowed hard, letting a small tremor run through my shoulders for Rachel to feel. I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes wide and perfectly empty. Inside my head, the seasoned builder was measuring the structural integrity of her trap, preparing to tear it all down, piece by piece. Derek unlocked the front door, his hand trembling so violently that the key scraped loudly against the brass plate, before finally sliding into the cylinder. I stepped over the threshold of my own home, dragging my feet against the hardwood floor to maintain the facade of the exhausted, confused old man. The familiar scent of lemon polish and the faint, lingering aroma of the cherry wood furniture I had built decades ago greeted me. But beneath it lay something entirely foreign. It was the sharp, sterile, unmistakable smell of an institution. I looked past the foyer and into the main living room, the space where I had watched Rachel take her first steps, the room where Carolyn and I had spent thousands of quiet evenings reading by the fireplace. The breath caught in my throat, not from feigned illness, but from genuine shock. My sanctuary had been completely desecrated. Right in the center of the living room, completely displacing the plush leather sofas and the hand-woven rug Caroline had bought in Turkey, sat a heavy mechanical hospital bed. Its chrome rails glinted under the recessed lighting, looking like the bars of a cage. Next to it stood a stainless steel tray table loaded with unopened packages of medical supplies. There were sterile wipes, adult protective garments, and plastic cups lined up with terrifying precision. An intravenous drip stand hovered over the headboard like a metallic vulture waiting for a meal. The television had been pushed aside to make room for a vitals monitor, its dark screen reflecting my horrified expression. This was not a temporary arrangement to help a sick parent recover from a minor ailment. This was a permanent installation. This was an end-of-life stage meticulously constructed for a man who still ran 3 miles every morning and could carry 50 pounds of cement without breaking a sweat. I allowed Rachel to lead me further into the room, my eyes sweeping over every detail of her treachery. On the heavy oak coffee table, neatly arranged beside a stack of fresh towels, lay a thick manila folder. The logo of a prominent, highly aggressive private psychiatric clinic in downtown Seattle was printed boldly across the top page. I could see the bold black letters of the document title from where I stood. It was an emergency petition for an involuntary psychiatric hold, complete with intake forms and medication consent waivers. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place with terrifying clarity. The birthday dinner had never existed at all. If I had walked through that front door last night at 7 o'clock, I would not have been greeted by friends from the construction business or a home-cooked roast. I would have walked directly into an ambush. I pictured the scene she had arranged. A private medical transport team would have been waiting in the shadows of my kitchen. A doctor on her payroll would have been standing exactly where I was standing, now ready to declare me an immediate danger to myself. They would have strapped me to that mechanical bed, administered a heavy sedative to silence my protests, and hauled me away into the night under the guise of an emergency medical intervention. By the time the sun came up today, I would have been locked inside a psychiatric ward, stripped of my legal rights, my phone, and my voice, and Rachel would have had immediate unhindered access to my $7 million. But I did not come home. My 40-year instinct, triggered by Derek's desperate phone call, had completely derailed her meticulously planned timeline. The medical team had likely waited for hours before finally packing up and leaving in frustration, forcing Rachel to improvise her morning performance at the motel with the local police. I felt a surge of cold, hard anger radiating through my chest, but I quickly suppressed it. I let my knees buckle slightly, leaning my dead weight against Rachel. "Oh my," I whispered, letting my voice waver with feigned anxiety. "Why is that bed in here, sweetie? Are you sick?" Rachel wrapped her arm tightly around my waist, her grip bruising my ribs, and guided me forcefully toward the mechanical mattress. "No, Daddy," she cooed, her voice echoing in the hollow, transformed room. "This is for you. The doctor said you need to rest, and your old bed upstairs is just too dangerous for you now. You might fall. We are going to keep you right here, where I can watch you every single second." She pushed me down until I was sitting on the edge of the stiff, sterile mattress. She lifted my legs, swinging them onto the bed with a rough, impatient energy that betrayed her sweet tone. "Lay back now," she commanded. I complied, staring up at the ceiling as she pulled a thin, scratchy hospital blanket over my chest. I watched from the corner of my eye as she walked back to the front door. Derek was still standing in the foyer, his face a mask of silent agony. Rachel grabbed the heavy deadbolt with her manicured hand. The metallic click of the lock turning echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. She pulled the key out, slipped it into her pocket, and turned back to face me with a cold, triumphant smile. The reality of my grim situation settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. I was now a helpless prisoner in the very house I had built to protect my family. The walls that had once provided warmth and safety were now the solid boundaries of my forced confinement. My own daughter stood as my warden, armed with forged medical documents and absolute conviction. She thought she had won. She thought the old man was completely broken. She had absolutely no idea she was securely locked inside with a very patient predator. The weekend passed in a blur of forced medications and patronizing conversations I pretended to forget. By the time Monday morning arrived, the heavy rain had cleared, leaving a pale gray light filtering through the living room blinds. Rachel appeared at the foot of my bed just before 7 o'clock. She wore a sharp navy business suit radiating the cold authority of a corporate chief financial officer. She checked the vitals monitor, smoothed my blanket, and turned her attention to the woman sitting on my recliner. My newly hired nurse, a burly caregiver named Beatrice, spent more time scrolling through her phone than looking at her patient. Rachel instructed Beatrice not to let me out of her sight, and to call her immediately if I became combative. Rachel leaned over, planted a cold kiss on my forehead, and walked out. The deadbolt clicked shut behind her, leaving me locked inside with my warden. For 2 hours I lay still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Beatrice chewing gum. She slouched in my chair, absorbed in a television show, treating me like a mildly irritating piece of furniture. I knew Mitchell was already working on my case, but I needed an update, and more importantly, I needed hard evidence. To get that, I had to create a window of opportunity. I waited until 10 o'clock, the time Beatrice usually brought me my morning snack. When she approached the bed carrying a plastic tray with a bowl of oatmeal and a large ceramic mug of steaming hot coffee, I knew my moment had arrived. I sat up slowly, letting my hands tremble with calculated weakness. I reached out for the coffee mug, making sure my fingers brushed clumsily against the handle. Beatrice sighed heavily, holding the mug out with obvious impatience. "Come on, Mr. Harrison," she muttered, her eyes drifting toward the television screen. "Take it before it gets cold." I wrapped my shaking fingers around the hot ceramic, and just as she let go of her end, I violently jerked my wrist downward. The mug slipped from my grasp, bouncing off the tray and shattering onto the hardwood floor. A dark, scalding wave of fresh coffee splashed upward, soaking directly into the front of Beatrice's faded blue scrubs and splattering across her white shoes. Beatrice let out a sharp, piercing shriek. She jumped back, swatting frantically at the hot liquid soaking through her clothes, her face flushing with sudden, intense anger. "Look what you did," she snapped, her professional demeanor instantly evaporating. "This is practically boiling." I shrank back against the pillows, pulling the blanket up to my chin, widening my eyes in a mask of genuine panic. "I am so sorry." I stammered, my voice trembling perfectly. My hands just would not stop shaking. It was an accident. Beatrice groaned loudly, pulling the wet fabric away from her skin. She glared at me with absolute disgust. "Stay exactly where you are," she commanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Do not move a single muscle. I need to get this off me before it burns, and I have to find a mop for this floor." She spun around and stormed out of the living room, her wet rubber soles squeaking furiously against the floorboards as she headed toward the downstairs laundry room to strip off her ruined top. The second she disappeared around the corner, the confused, frightened old man vanished completely. I threw off the hospital blanket and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My movements were sharp, precise, and completely silent. I reached under the thick mattress pad, right where the metal frame met the springs, and retrieved the small burner phone I had hidden there on the first night. I slipped my feet into my slippers and moved swiftly toward the ground floor half-bathroom, located at the end of the hallway, directly opposite the kitchen. I slipped inside, locked the door silently behind me, and turned on the faucet to mask any noise. I dialed Mitchell's private number. He picked up on the first ring. I kept my voice to an urgent, barely audible whisper. I said, "Mitchell, I have a maximum of 5 minutes. Get to the back alley behind my house. Come to the frosted window of the powder room. Do not let the neighbors see you." He simply replied, "I am already 2 blocks away." I stood in the cramped little bathroom watching the second hand on my wristwatch sweep in slow, agonizing circles. I could hear Beatrice in the distant laundry room cursing loudly as she rummaged through the cabinets looking for stain remover and a fresh towel. The tension in my chest tightened with every passing second. If she came back to the living room and found the bed empty, the illusion would be shattered, and Rachel would know I was completely lucid. Just as I considered aborting the plan and rushing back to the bed, a soft, rhythmic tapping came from the small frosted glass window above the toilet. I stepped up onto the closed toilet lid and quietly unlatched the heavy brass lock on the window. I pushed the glass outward just a few inches. The cool, damp Seattle air rushed into the bathroom, bringing with it the faint smell of pine needles. Mitchell's face appeared in the narrow gap. He looked grim, the deep lines around his mouth more pronounced than usual. He did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He reached inside his tailored wool coat and pulled out a thick, tightly bound manila folder. He slid it carefully through the narrow opening, his knuckles brushing against the wooden frame. I grabbed the heavy file, feeling the weight of the secrets hidden inside its pages. Mitchell looked directly into my eyes, his expression a mixture of profound sorrow and cold, calculating fury. He whispered through the crack in the glass, "You were right, Richard. She is bleeding you dry." I took the thick manila folder from Mitchell's hands, the weight of it feeling like an anchor pulling me down into a dark, suffocating abyss. Before I could ask him anything else, I heard the heavy squeaking footsteps of Beatrice approaching the hallway from the laundry room. I gave Mitchell a single sharp nod and quickly pulled the frosted glass window shut, latching the brass lock into place. I stepped down from the toilet, tucked the heavy folder beneath the waistband of my pajama pants, and pulled my loose shirt over it just as Beatrice pounded on the bathroom door. She yelled out, asking if I was all right in there. I pitched my voice high and unsteady, apologizing for taking so long, claiming my stomach was upset from the nerves. I opened the door to find her glaring at me now, wearing a faded yellow shirt that looked 2 sizes too small. She grabbed my arm roughly and marched me back to the mechanical hospital bed in the living room. I spent the rest of the agonizing afternoon lying perfectly still, the sharp edges of the folder digging into my side every time I shifted. I played the role of the docile, fading old man with absolute perfection, eating the bland soup she brought me, staring blankly at the daytime television shows and waiting for the sun to finally set. The hours dragged on like thick, slow-moving concrete. Finally, at 9 o'clock, Rachel returned home. She did not even bother coming into the living room to check on me. I heard the muffled sound of her voice in the kitchen as she paid Beatrice for the day and dismissed her. Then I heard the heavy click of the deadbolt, the sound of Rachel walking up the stairs, and the slam of her bedroom door. The house fell into a deep, oppressive silence. I waited another 2 hours, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, ensuring she was completely asleep. When midnight struck, I slowly pulled the scratchy hospital blanket completely over my head to create a small, dark tent. I reached into my overnight bag that Rachel had brought from the motel, my fingers digging past the socks until I found my small metal pocket flashlight. I clicked it on. The narrow beam of white light illuminated the small, confined space beneath the blanket. My hands were perfectly steady now as I pulled the thick manila folder from my waistband and opened it across my lap. The very first document in the stack was a copy of a legal filing from 6 months ago. The bold black letters across the top read, "Durable Power of Attorney." My eyes scanned the dense legal text, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It granted Rachel Harrison complete, unconditional, and immediate control over my finances, real estate, and medical decisions. At the bottom of the last page, sitting right above the notary stamp, was my signature. Except it was not my signature. It was a masterful, meticulously practiced forgery. The loop of the letter R was slightly too wide, and the heavy downward stroke of the H lacked the pressure I always apply after 40 years of holding heavy carpenter pencils. But to a bank teller or a careless notary, it looked authentic enough to hand over the keys to my entire life. I stared at the forged ink, feeling a sickening wave of betrayal wash over me. She had not just panicked because I missed a birthday dinner. She had been actively plotting my financial execution for half a year. I flipped the page following the blood trail she had left behind in the financial records Mitchell had dug up. The next set of documents consisted of property deeds and bank statements. They were for 3 specific commercial rental properties I owned in the industrial district of Seattle. I had purchased those warehouses 20 years ago, renovated them with my own bare hands, and leased them out to reliable distribution companies. They were the crown jewels of my real estate portfolio, generating a massive, steady stream of passive income that I had planned to leave to my grandson. But as I read the current loan summaries, the breath caught in my throat. Rachel had used the forged power of attorney to secretly remortgage all 3 of those properties. She had essentially taken out massive high-interest loans against the warehouses, using the buildings as collateral. The documents showed that she had extracted $2.5 million in cold, hard cash from the equity I had spent decades building. She had stripped the value from my life's work without me ever knowing a single thing about it. I moved the flashlight down the page, tracing the flow of the stolen money. The $2.5 million had not gone into any of my personal accounts. It had been wired directly into an offshore corporate account registered under the name of the tech startup, where Rachel worked as the chief financial officer. She was embezzling from her own company using her father's blood, sweat, and tears to cover her corporate crimes. But the money had not been enough. I reached the very last document in the folder. It was a final notice warning from a predatory commercial lending firm printed on bright red paper. I shined the flashlight directly onto the bold text in the center of the page. Because Rachel had taken out short-term loans, the terms were absolutely brutal. A massive, unpayable balloon payment of $2.8 million was due in exactly 5 days, or they would execute an immediate foreclosure. If that payment was not made by the close of business on Friday, I would lose everything I had built. She did not just want to lock me away. She needed the $7 million sitting in my liquid accounts to save herself from prison. I stared at the glowing red paper in the beam of my flashlight, my mind working furiously to connect the remaining dots. The urgency of her timeline finally made terrifying sense. She had not chosen my 73rd birthday for this ambush out of some twisted sense of irony. She had chosen it because she was completely out of time. I slid the foreclosure notice back into the manila folder and picked up my burner phone. The keypad felt tiny beneath my thick fingers, but I carefully typed out a secure text message to Mitchell. I told him to stop looking at my personal accounts and start digging deeply into her employer. I needed to know absolutely everything about the internal financial health of her tech startup. I hit send, powered down the device, and slid everything back under the mattress pad. I spent the remaining hours of the night staring into the darkness, listening to the heavy rain start up again outside my window, calculating my next move. Tuesday morning brought the same humiliating routine. Rachel came downstairs, checked the heavy locks, gave me a hollow kiss on the cheek, and left for her corporate office. Beatrice arrived shortly after, smelling of cheap perfume and stale coffee, and immediately turned on the television to a loud volume. I played my part flawlessly, eating my breakfast with trembling hands and staring blankly at the wall. But beneath the fragile surface, my mind was sharp and restless, waiting patiently for Mitchell to deliver the final piece of the puzzle. The confirmation came just after lunch. Beatrice had gone into the kitchen to make herself a sandwich, leaving me alone in the living room for a few precious minutes. I slipped the burner phone from its hiding spot and opened the new encrypted message from Mitchell. The text was long, incredibly detailed, and devastatingly clear. Mitchell had used his extensive corporate contacts to peer behind the curtain of Rachel's company. As the chief financial officer, Rachel had been granted absolute authority over the startup's investment capital. Over the past 2 years, she had been systematically siphoning funds into private offshore accounts to fund high-risk cryptocurrency investments. She had gambled with company money, expecting to make a massive profit, replace the stolen funds, and keep the difference for herself. But the volatile market had crashed. The investments had completely evaporated. She was sitting on a massive gaping hole in the company ledgers, and the walls were rapidly closing in. The board of directors had grown highly suspicious of her evasive financial reports. Mitchell confirmed that the Securities and Exchange Commission had officially notified the startup of a comprehensive surprise audit scheduled for next Monday. If the federal auditors looked at her books, they would instantly discover the missing millions. She would be arrested, indicted for federal wire fraud and embezzlement, and likely sentenced to decades in federal prison. That was why she had desperately forged the power of attorney 6 months ago to borrow against my commercial warehouses. She was frantically trying to plug the bleeding hole. But $2.5 million had not been nearly enough to cover her tracks, and now the predatory lenders were coming for the buildings. She was backed into a corner facing financial ruin, total disgrace, and a very long prison sentence. My liquid $7 million was her absolute only lifeline. If she could lock me in a psychiatric facility and gain legal guardianship by the end of this week, she could drain my accounts, pay off the balloon mortgage, replace the stolen company funds before the federal auditors arrived, and walk away entirely unscathed. I slipped the phone back under the mattress, just as Beatrice walked back into the living room, chewing loudly on her sandwich. I closed my eyes, feigning sleep, while the terrifying magnitude of Rachel's sheer desperation settled over me. She was no longer just a greedy daughter, trying to unfairly speed up her inheritance. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were capable of unspeakable violence. If she did not get her hands on that money by Friday afternoon, she would be completely destroyed, and she was more than willing to destroy me to save herself. But as I lay there analyzing the dangerous battlefield, a crucial flaw in her legal strategy emerged. To legally finalize the emergency conservatorship, she could not simply rely on a single corrupt doctor. She would need a compelling narrative for the judge. She would need a witness to testify under oath to my supposed mental decline, someone credible who lived close to me, someone exactly like her husband. I opened my eyes slightly, looking toward the locked front door. Derek. He was the only loose end in this entire nightmare. He had known about the ambush. He had risked everything to warn me from the diner parking lot. Yet he had driven the car that brought me back to this prison, and he had stood silently in the foyer while Rachel locked the deadbolt. Why was a man who clearly possessed a conscience actively participating in a severe federal crime against his own father-in-law? Rachel must be holding something absolutely catastrophic over his head. She was brutally blackmailing him, forcing his compliance to ensure he would testify against me in a court of law. If I was going to dismantle her wicked empire and protect my own freedom, I needed to figure out exactly what she was using to control him. I needed Derek to flip. I needed him to take the witness stand and tell the judge the absolute truth about the forged documents and the fake dementia. But he was terrified of her. I had to find a clever way to escape this mechanical bed bypass Beatrice and corner my son-in-law without Rachel knowing. I had to offer him a way out of his own prison, or neither of us would survive the coming week. Wednesday afternoon presented the perfect opportunity. The heavy Seattle rain had returned, drumming against the windows. Beatrice had eaten a massive lunch and settled into my leather recliner. Within 30 minutes, her chin dropped, and the room filled with deep snores. I knew she was a heavy sleeper, but I moved with caution. I slipped out of the bed, leaving the blanket piled high to mimic a sleeping body. I wore thick wool socks to silence my footsteps. I crept down the hallway and opened the door leading to the unfinished basement. The air smelled of old concrete. I navigated through the shadows until I reached the small window set high into the foundation wall. I had installed that window myself 30 years ago. I knew exactly how to unlatch the rusted lock without making a sound. It took significant effort for my 73-year-old shoulders to pull myself up and push the glass outward, but adrenaline is a powerful fuel. I squeezed through the narrow opening, tumbling out onto the wet grass of my own backyard. I brushed the dirt from my clothes, slipped on a pair of boots I had stashed by the back door, and walked swiftly down the alleyway. I kept my head down against the chilling wind and flagged down a passing taxi 2 blocks away. I gave the driver the address of the commercial high-rise downtown where Derek worked. I knew his routine. He always left at exactly 4:15 to beat the worst evening traffic. I arrived at the parking garage adjacent to his building just before 4 o'clock. The air inside smelled of exhaust and damp asphalt. I found his gray sedan parked on the 3rd level, tucked away in a dimly lit corner. I stepped back into the shadows behind a concrete pillar and waited. My heart beat with a slow, steady intensity. I pulled out my burner phone and silently activated the voice recording application. 10 minutes later, the heavy metal door of the stairwell echoed loudly. Derek walked out into the garage. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, his tie was loosened, and he moved with the heavy steps of a man carrying the weight of the world. He reached into his pocket for his keys, looking down at the concrete floor. He never saw me step out. I moved quickly, placing my calloused hand firmly on his shoulder, just as he reached for the door handle. I said his name, keeping my voice low and sharp. Derek jumped as if he had been struck by lightning. He spun around, his eyes wide with absolute terror, dropping his keys onto the ground with a loud clatter. When he realized it was me standing upright and completely lucid, the blood drained entirely from his face. He stumbled back against the side of his car, his mouth opening without a single sound coming out. I stepped closer, refusing to let him look away. I said, "We are going to have a very honest conversation right now, Derek. I know about the $2.5 million. I know about the forged power of attorney. I know the federal auditors are coming for her on Monday. What I do not know is why a decent man is helping his wife send an innocent man to a psychiatric ward. For a long moment, Derek just stared at me, his chest heaving, as he struggled to process the fact that the confused old man was an illusion. Then the dam broke. He buried his face in his hands, and a raw sob tore through his throat. He slid down the side of the car until he was sitting on the cold, concrete floor, weeping, with the absolute despair of a broken man. I stood over him, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bloodshot and filled with hatred for his own wife. He whispered, "I tried to warn you. I risked everything to make that call on your birthday. I wanted you to run. Because if you came home, she was going to force me to sign the witness statements." I asked him what she was holding over him, why he did not just go to the police himself. Derek wiped his face, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. He said, "It is about my son. It is about your grandson. 6 months ago, I found out about the offshore accounts. I threatened to expose her and file for divorce. The next day, she showed me a medical file. She had paid that same corrupt doctor to draft a detailed report claiming I had been physically abusing my boy. She told me that if I ever tried to leave her, or if I ever breathed a word about the money, she would file the report with Child Protective Services. She promised me I would go to prison for child abuse, and I would never see my son again. She has me in a vice, Richard. If I do not testify that you are losing your mind, I lose my boy forever." The sheer evil of her plan hit me like a physical blow. She was using my grandson as a hostage to force Derek to participate in my destruction. I looked down at the man sitting on the floor. He was not a coward. He was a father terrified of losing his child to a monster. I pulled out the burner phone. The red recording light was blinking steadily in the dim garage. I stopped the recording and saved the file. I reached down, grabbed Derek by the arm, and pulled him up from the concrete floor. I looked him dead in the eye, letting him see the cold, calculated fury of a man who had spent 40 years building foundations and knew exactly how to demolish them. I said, "Do not worry, son. I am going to burn her empire to the ground." I left Derek standing in the damp shadows of the parking garage. The drive back to my neighborhood was a blur of gray rain and calculated thoughts. The taxi dropped me off 2 blocks from my house, and I used the alleyway to approach my backyard, keeping entirely out of sight. My 73-year-old joints ached in severe protest, but the fire burning in my chest gave me the tremendous strength I needed. I slipped my heavy work boots off, squeezed backward through the small basement window, and pulled the rusted latch shut behind me. Moving with silent precision, I crept upstairs. Beatrice was exactly where I had left her, snoring loudly in the recliner. I slid under the scratchy hospital blanket, pulled it up to my chin, and let my breathing slow into a steady rhythm. I was safely back inside the cage, waiting patiently for the warden to return. She arrived just before 6 in the evening. The heavy deadbolt clicked, the front door swung open, and the high heels of Rachel clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. But this time she was not alone. I heard the low murmuring voices of 2 men stepping into the house behind her. Beatrice jolted awake and quickly turned off the television. Rachel marched into the living room, her face a mask of cold efficiency. Behind her walked a tall, thin man carrying a black leather medical bag. His eyes darted around my living room like a thief appraising a jewelry store. Next to him stood a much older man with thick white hair and a flushed, arrogant face. He leaned heavily on the polished wooden cane, projecting an air of unquestionable authority that felt entirely unearned and incredibly dangerous. I kept my eyes half closed, maintaining the flawless illusion of a foggy, medicated slumber as Rachel approached the bed. She placed a cold hand on my shoulder and shook me gently. "Wake up, Daddy," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I brought some very important people to see you today." I let out a confused, pained groan and slowly opened my eyes, blinking against the harsh ceiling lights, as if I had forgotten where I was entirely. "Who is it, sweetie?" I mumbled, slurring my words with careful precision. "Are they here to fix the roof again? I want to go back to sleep." Rachel smiled, but her eyes were utterly dead. "These are my friends, Daddy," she said. "This is Dr. Thorne, and this is Judge Caldwell. They just want to ask you a few simple questions." The pieces of her endgame rapidly assembled in my mind. She was not waiting for a standard court date to finalize the conservatorship. She brought a corrupt private psychiatrist to conduct a sham evaluation in my living room, and a retired compromised judge to rubber stamp the medical certificate on the spot. Wealthy corporate executives often used private judges to bypass the clogged public court system and keep their dirty financial secrets safely hidden. Judge Caldwell was likely handsomely compensated for a few hours of his time to sign away the remaining years of my natural life. Dr. Thorne stepped forward, placing his bag on the stainless steel tray table next to my bed. He did not bother to check my vitals or consult the monitor. He simply pulled a yellow legal pad and a silver fountain pen from his jacket. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison," the doctor said, his voice completely slick. "Your daughter has expressed some very deep concerns about your cognitive health. She tells me you have been wandering off, getting lost, and forgetting important events. We are just going to have a little chat to evaluate your memory and orientation. There is absolutely nothing for you to worry about today." Judge Caldwell pulled a dining room chair over and sat down heavily, resting his aged hands firmly on his cane. He looked at me with a mixture of complete boredom and mild disgust, clearly eager to finish this illegal transaction and collect his payment. He represented the total sickening corruption of the legal system I was about to be crushed under. Rachel pulled up a stool and sat close to my pillow, taking my hand tightly in hers. She squeezed my fingers hard enough to cause pain, a silent warning to cooperate, while simultaneously projecting the perfect image of a devoted, heartbroken caregiver for her paid audience. I looked at the three of them, perfectly positioned around my bed, like vultures circling a dying animal. They thought they were looking at a broken old man whose mind was slipping away into darkness. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting in a trap of their own making. The burner phone, loaded with the explosive audio recording of the confession from Derek, was tucked beneath the mattress pad, just inches from my hand. I was armed to the teeth with evidence, but I could not fire the fatal shot just yet. I had to patiently let them commit the crime first. I had to let them put their permanent signatures on the fraudulent legal documents to ensure they would all go down together. I let my head loll slightly to the side, maintaining a blank, terrified expression. I gave a slow, trembling nod to Dr. Thorne. "I am just so tired," I whispered, staring vacantly at his yellow notepad. Dr. Thorne smiled a thin, predatory smile and clicked his silver pen. "Well, let us see if we can clear things up for you today, Richard," he said softly. "I need you to answer my questions to the best of your ability. Try to focus on my words, and please do not be alarmed if you cannot remember everything. We are only here to ensure you get the proper medical care you desperately need." The cruel psychological interrogation had officially begun right here in my very own home, and I fully prepared to execute my final act. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at his legal pad. He clicked his silver pen, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Let us start with something simple, Richard," he said, his voice slow and patronizing. "Can you tell me what day of the week it is today, and perhaps the current year?" I let my eyes wander aimlessly around the room before looking back at him. I furrowed my brow, pretending to search through a fog. "I think it is Sunday," I mumbled. "Yes, Sunday. And the year is 1998 because we just finished the new warehouse." I looked over at Rachel with a vacant smile. "Did the boys finish the roof yet, sweetie?" Rachel sighed heavily. "He has been trapped in the past all week," she whispered. "It is heartbreaking to watch him deteriorate so quickly." Dr. Thorne nodded sympathetically, scribbling notes. He looked back at me, his expression devoid of genuine concern. "That is all right, Richard," he said. "Let us try something else. Can you tell me the name of the current President of the United States?" I stared blankly, letting my mouth hang open. I slowly reached up and scratched my cheek. "Well, it is Ronald Reagan," I replied with certainty. "I saw him on television yesterday talking about the economy. He is doing a fine job." Judge Caldwell let out an impatient huff, tapping his cane against the floor. "Clearly the man is not competent," he muttered. "Can we please expedite this process? I have a dinner reservation, and this environment is depressing." Dr. Thorne raised a hand. "Just a few more protocol questions." "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we must ensure the evaluation appears thorough on paper." He turned his attention back to me. "Richard, I am going to ask you to do some basic mathematics. Can you count backward from 100 by sevens?" I blinked rapidly, acting as if he had asked me to explain quantum physics. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to concentrate with agonizing effort. 100, I started slowly. Then 90. Then maybe 81. I opened my eyes, my fingers twitching as if trying to physically count the numbers. And then 60. No, wait. I am sorry, I cannot do it. The numbers are swimming around in my head today. I let my chin drop to my chest, projecting a profound sense of defeat and shame. I needed them to believe my spirit was broken. Rachel moved her hand and gently stroked my hair. "It is okay, Daddy," she cooed softly. "You do not have to think about these hard things anymore. I am here to take care of everything." I looked up at her, letting my eyes fill with actual tears. The tears were real, but they were not born of confusion. They were born of a deep grief for the daughter. I used to know the little girl who had become a ruthless monster. I reached out and touched her cheek, letting my hand shake. "You are so good to me, Caroline," I whispered, using my late wife's name. "You always know how to make me feel better." "I miss you so much, Caroline." That was the final nail in the coffin. Rachel stiffened for a second at the sound of her mother's name, but quickly recovered, turning a tragic, tear-filled gaze toward the doctor and the judge. "You see," she said, her voice breaking perfectly, "he does not even know who I am anymore. He thinks my mother is still alive. It is completely unsafe for him to make any financial or medical decisions. He is a danger to himself." Dr. Thorne nodded solemnly, clicking his pen shut. He had exactly what he needed. The performance was complete, and the trap was perfectly set. "I have seen more than enough," the doctor declared, his tone suddenly brisk and professional. "Based on this direct evaluation, I am officially certifying that Richard Harrison lacks the cognitive capacity to manage his own affairs. He is suffering from severe advanced dementia." Dr. Thorne pulled a thick, official-looking document from his black leather bag. It was the medical certificate of incapacity. He signed his name with a flourish at the bottom of the page and handed the document directly to Judge Caldwell. The judge did not even bother to read the medical findings. He simply pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, snatched the paper, and scrawled his signature across the judicial order line. The metallic scratch of his pen against the paper sealed my fate in their eyes. With that single stroke, the emergency conservatorship was legally granted. Rachel was now officially in complete control of my life, my health, and my $7 million. Judge Caldwell stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. "The matter is settled," he said dismissively. "You have full conservatorship, Rachel. Now, if you will excuse me, I am going to be late for my dinner." Dr. Thorne packed his bag, shook Rachel's hand, and followed the judge out of the living room. The front door clicked shut, leaving just the two of us in the silent house. The tragic loving daughter act vanished instantly. Rachel stood up, her posture straightening into a pose of absolute dominance. She looked down at me, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated greed. She reached out and gave me a condescending, humiliating pat on the head, treating me like an obedient dog. Good boy, Daddy, she whispered down to me maliciously. Now let us finally secure our financial future. She turned away from the mechanical bed, walked over to the stainless steel medical tray table, and eagerly pulled her sleek silver laptop from her briefcase. She opened the screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard, as she logged into the banking portal to execute the legal transfer of my entire $7 million into her newly granted conservatorship account right in front of me. The soft blue light of the laptop screen illuminated Rachel's face, highlighting the sharp, greedy contour of her cheekbones. She sat on the edge of the medical stool, completely ignoring my presence on the bed, her entire focus absorbed by the digital threshold of absolute wealth. I watched through half-closed eyes as she carefully typed in her secure credentials. She was so incredibly confident, so completely assured of her own supreme intellect. She navigated to the primary checking account, the central hub where my entire liquid fortune had always been stored. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the keyboard, entering the newly authorized routing numbers for her conservatorship account. She was just one single click away from securing the $2.5 million she desperately needed to stop the foreclosure and the remaining millions she needed to save herself from the federal auditors. She took a deep, satisfied breath, her chest rising and falling with the thrill of victory. She positioned the cursor over the bright green button labeled Execute Transfer. With a dramatic, almost theatrical flourish, she pressed down on the trackpad. The screen buffered. A small gray circle spun endlessly in the center of the display. For a brief, agonizing moment, the room was perfectly silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle sound of the rain against the window. Then the screen flashed. The bright green button vanished, replaced immediately by a harsh, glaring red banner spanning the entire width of the page. The error message was written in bold, unforgiving text. Transaction denied. Insufficient funds available to complete this request. Rachel frowned, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in a tight knot of absolute confusion. She let out a short, dismissive scoff, shaking her head, as if the bank had simply made a foolish administrative error. She muttered something under her breath about terrible internet connections and outdated banking software. She quickly moved her finger across the trackpad, moving the cursor to the top of the browser window. She quickly hit the refresh button, fully expecting the system to correct itself and display the massive $7 million balance she knew was supposed to be sitting right there. The page reloaded instantly. The red banner disappeared, replaced by the standard account summary dashboard. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes darting to the top right corner of the screen, where the total available balance was always displayed in large, bold numbers. The breath completely left her lungs in a sharp, sudden gasp. She froze, her entire body turning to rigid stone. The number staring back at her was not 7 million. It was not even 7,000. The screen clearly and unequivocally displayed a checking account balance of exactly $14.00. For a full 10 seconds, Rachel did not blink. She did not breathe. She just stared at the two lonely digits, her mind violently rejecting the reality of the glowing pixels. Then the initial shock shattered, giving way to pure, unadulterated panic. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She frantically grabbed the laptop, pulling it closer to her face, as if decreasing the physical distance would somehow change the numbers. She rapidly clicked on the high-yield savings account tab. The screen loaded. $0. She slammed her finger onto the trackpad, opening the mutual fund portfolio. $0. She clicked on the liquid stock accounts. 0. Every single financial reservoir I had spent 40 years filling had been completely drained. The money was gone. The realization hit her with the destructive force of a freight train. The irrevocable trust Mitchell and I had activated in the dark motel room had functioned perfectly. The massive vault was sealed tight, and her fraudulent conservatorship documents were completely useless against it. The $7 million was legally untouchable, entirely beyond her reach. Rachel let out a choked, guttural sound, a terrifying mixture of a sob and a scream. Her chest began to heave violently as she started hyperventilating, struggling to pull air into her lungs. The pristine, confident corporate executive completely disintegrated right in front of my eyes. She clawed at her own hair, her manicured nails digging into her scalp. She slammed her fists down onto the keyboard, screaming that it was impossible, that the money had to be there, that the bank was stealing from her. The piercing sound of her hysterical screams echoed violently through the house, reaching the foyer, where Dr. Thorne and Judge Caldwell were just putting on their heavy winter coats to leave. The front door had not yet fully closed. Hearing the absolute madness erupting from the living room, the two men rushed back down the hallway, their faces pale with sudden alarm. They rounded the corner and stopped dead in their tracks, staring in shock at the woman who had just paid them for a flawless, quiet, legal execution. Rachel was completely unhinged, weeping and tearing at her clothes, knocking the heavy medical supplies off the tray table in a blind, destructive rage. Dr. Thorne took a hesitant step forward, his medical bag gripping tightly in his hand. He looked from the wildly thrashing Rachel to the open laptop displaying the $14 balance, and the terrifying truth began to dawn on him. Judge Caldwell leaned heavily on his wooden cane, his arrogant posture instantly collapsing. The retired judge was a corrupt man, but he was not a stupid man. Seeing the empty bank accounts and the hysterical, cornered woman, he realized immediately that this was not a simple family dispute over a wealthy estate. They had just permanently attached their professional names and signatures to a fraudulent medical document for a woman who possessed absolutely zero financial assets to protect them. They realized with a sudden and sickening drop in their hollow stomachs that they had just walked blindly into a massive, catastrophic fraud. They were now firmly anchored to a sinking ship, completely exposed to the wrath of the federal government. Dr. Thorne and Judge Caldwell did not say a single word of farewell. They turned, pushed open the front door, and sprinted into the cold Seattle rain. They were desperate to distance themselves from the financial explosion taking place. The door slammed behind them, echoing like a final judgment through the house. Rachel did not even notice they had left. She was completely consumed by a blinding, chaotic rage. She slammed the silver laptop shut so hard I thought the delicate hinges would snap, and she spun around to face me. The carefully constructed mask of the loving, concerned daughter was entirely gone, replaced by something dark and ugly. Her face was twisted into a grotesque expression of sheer desperation, her makeup smeared across her cheeks from her earlier theatrical tears. She closed the distance to my mechanical hospital bed in 3 aggressive strides. She grabbed the lapels of my pajama shirt with both hands, yanking me forward so violently that the metal bed frame groaned in protest. "Where is the money?" she screamed at me, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. Her manicured nails dug painfully through the fabric of my shirt and directly into my chest. "Where did you put my $7 million, you senile old fool? Tell me right now." She shook me back and forth, her breath hot and shallow against my face. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the precious opportunity to deliver a psychological blow so severe it would completely shatter her remaining sanity. I did not fight back against her grip. I let my head wobble loosely on my shoulders with every violent shake she delivered. I widened my eyes in a display of absolute uncomprehending terror. I let my lower lip tremble uncontrollably as I looked up at her distorted, furious face. "Money," I whimpered, keeping my voice pitched high and fragile like a frightened child. "I do not have any money. Did I buy too much candy at the store today, sweetie? I am so sorry if I spent too much on the chocolate cake for my birthday party. Please do not be mad at me, Caroline. I will be good. I promise I will be a good boy." Rachel let out an agonized scream of pure frustration and shoved me backward onto the stiff mattress. She turned away from the bed, pacing the entire length of the living room, like a trapped animal in a cage. She was gasping for air, running her shaking hands repeatedly through her previously perfect hair. She began to tear the room apart with a frantic, destructive energy. She ripped open the drawers of the antique wooden cabinet by the stone fireplace, throwing old photograph albums, loose receipts, and cherished family mementos onto the hardwood floor. She flipped over the heavy cushions of the leather sofa, desperately searching for a hidden checkbook, a secret bank statement, or any tiny scrap of paper that could explain how $7 million had completely vanished from a secure checking account without her knowledge. She muttered wildly to herself, her voice a rapid, terrifying whisper as she calculated the impossible math of her impending doom. The predatory commercial lenders were expecting a balloon payment of almost $3 million in exactly 3 days. The federal auditors from the Securities and Exchange Commission were arriving at her corporate office bright and early on Monday morning. She had absolutely no time left to quietly figure this out. She needed those liquid funds immediately, or she was going to spend the best years of her life sitting inside a federal penitentiary. She stopped pacing suddenly and stared blindly at the wall, her chest heaving as a new desperate theory formed in her panicked mind. If I was truly suffering from severe advanced dementia, as she had just legally certified with her corrupt medical professionals, then I could not have possibly possessed the cognitive ability to orchestrate a complex financial transfer of that magnitude on my own. Someone else had to have done it. In her twisted logic, she convinced herself that some unknown third party had discovered my massive wealth, taken advantage of my supposedly failing mind, and drained the accounts right under her nose. She rushed back to the stainless steel tray table, her hands trembling so violently she knocked a plastic cup of water onto the floor, splashing her expensive shoes. She grabbed her smartphone and quickly dialed a number. I lay perfectly still on the mechanical bed, watching her through the narrow slits of my half-closed eyes, listening intently to every single word. She was calling her senior corporate attorney. When he answered the line, she did not bother with professional greetings. She barked orders with a frantic, shrill intensity that bordered on absolute madness. She demanded that he immediately file an emergency injunction with the state court. She claimed that her severely incapacitated father had just been the victim of massive financial elder abuse by an unknown predator. She ordered him to secure a hearing for the very next morning, instructing him to demand a state judge freeze all of my assets, trace the missing $7 million, and legally reverse whatever fraudulent transfer had just taken place. She demanded he work through the night to make it happen. She hung up the phone, her chest rising and falling heavily as she stared down at the blank screen of her laptop. She thought she was taking back control. She thought she was using the full power of the legal system to hunt down the thief who had stolen her salvation. She had absolutely no idea she was the only thief in the room. By demanding a formal recorded judicial hearing in an open state court, she was willingly dragging her entire conspiracy out of the shadows and directly into the unforgiving light of the law. She had just walked blindly, confidently, and aggressively right into the very center of my inescapable trap. The next morning, the sky over Seattle was a bruised, heavy gray, reflecting the storm that was about to break inside the King County Courthouse. Rachel had arranged for a private medical transport to bring me to the courthouse, maintaining her charade of the devoted caregiver until the bitter end. I was wheeled into the imposing wood-paneled courtroom in a standard-issue wheelchair, a thin plaid blanket draped carefully over my knees to emphasize my supposed frailty. Rachel walked closely beside me, her hand resting firmly on my shoulder, projecting an image of quiet, dignified sorrow to the small audience gathering in the gallery. The courtroom was practically empty, save for a few court clerks and the heavy, silent presence of my son-in-law Derek, who sat rigidly in the second row, staring blankly at the polished floor. I kept my head bowed, my chin resting near my chest, but my eyes darted rapidly beneath half-closed lids, taking in every detail of the battlefield. The room smelled of old paper and lemon pledge. At the plaintiff's table, Rachel's senior corporate attorney was frantically organizing thick stacks of legal binders, his face flushed with the adrenaline of a high-stakes emergency hearing. And then there was Mitchell. My old friend sat alone at the defense table wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture completely relaxed, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy radiating from Rachel's team. As Rachel wheeled me up to the defense table and parked my chair next to him, Mitchell did not look at me. He simply opened a thin manila folder, his face entirely unreadable. A heavy wooden door at the back of the room opened, and the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Eleanor Vance, a woman known throughout the state for her sharp intellect and absolute intolerance for legal nonsense, took her seat behind the high bench. She adjusted her reading glasses, looking down at the thick emergency injunction file Rachel's attorney had submitted during the night. The heavy silence in the courtroom was broken only by the rustling of paper as she quickly scanned the documents. Rachel's attorney stood up, buttoning his jacket with a swift, confident motion. "Your Honor," he began, his voice echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged room. "We are here on a matter of extreme urgency and devastating financial abuse. My client, Rachel Harrison, was granted full legal conservatorship over her father, Richard Harrison, late yesterday evening. Mr. Harrison is suffering from severe advanced cognitive decline. He is entirely incapable of managing his own affairs. I have submitted the certified medical evaluation signed by Dr. Thorne and approved by Judge Caldwell." The attorney paused dramatically, turning to point a stiff finger toward my wheelchair. He continued, his voice rising in volume. "However, just hours after the conservatorship was finalized, my client discovered that her father's entire life savings, a sum exceeding $7 million, had been completely drained from his personal accounts. We have reason to believe that an unknown third-party predator, perhaps someone manipulating Mr. Harrison in his vulnerable state, executed a fraudulent transfer to an irrevocable trust. We are asking this court to immediately freeze all of Mr. Harrison's assets, trace the destination of these stolen funds, and grant my client the immediate legal authority to reverse this malicious transfer and recover her father's money before it is lost forever." Rachel began to weep silently, pressing a delicate white tissue to her eyes. She leaned forward in her chair, turning her face toward the judge. "Please, Your Honor," she whispered, her voice cracking with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "He worked his entire life for that money. He is so confused. He does not even know his own name half the time. Someone has stolen everything from him, and I just want to protect him. I just want to keep my father safe." Judge Vance looked over the rims of her glasses, studying the weeping woman for a long, silent moment. She then turned her sharp gaze toward the defense table. Mitchell stood up slowly, calmly buttoning his charcoal suit. He did not raise his voice. He simply leaned forward, resting his hands lightly on the edge of the wooden table. "Your Honor," Mitchell said smoothly, "the defense does not dispute that a transfer of $7 million occurred. We do not dispute the existence of the irrevocable trust. However, we vehemently dispute the completely absurd assertion that it was a fraudulent transaction executed by an unknown predator." Rachel's attorney scoffed loudly, slapping his hand against his legal binder. "That is impossible," he objected. "The medical records clearly prove Mr. Harrison lacks the mental capacity to execute a complex legal maneuver like a safe harbor trust. He could not possibly have authorized it." Judge Vance raised a single hand, instantly silencing the corporate attorney. She looked directly at Mitchell. "Mr. Gallagher," she said, her tone cautious but intrigued, "if your client did not authorize the transfer, and you admit the transfer occurred, who exactly moved the $7 million out of his accounts?" Mitchell smiled, a very small, very cold smile. "He moved the money himself." "Your Honor," Mitchell replied, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet courtroom. "He authorized the transfer completely of his own free will with full cognitive awareness 3 days ago, long before the fraudulent conservatorship was ever filed." A shocked murmur rippled through the small gallery. Rachel stopped crying instantly, her tissue dropping to the table. She stared at Mitchell, her face twisting in sudden, uncomprehending rage. Her attorney leaped to his feet. "Objection! Your Honor," he shouted, "this is a blatant lie. Look at the man. He is practically catatonic." Judge Vance ignored the shouting attorney. She leaned far over the heavy wooden bench, her piercing eyes locking directly onto me, sitting hunched and seemingly broken in the wheelchair. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. She asked the question that would shatter the illusion once and for all. "Mr. Harrison," she asked, her voice ringing with absolute authority, "do you understand where you are?" I did not answer the judge immediately. Instead, I let the heavy, suffocating silence hang in the quiet courtroom. I slowly reached down and took hold of the plaid blanket draped over my knees. My hands were no longer trembling. The fabricated weakness, the rehearsed frailty I had worn like a costume for the past 4 days, vanished completely. I pulled the thin blanket aside and let it fall down to the floor. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of the wheelchair and pushed myself up. I did not struggle. I stood to my full height, straightening my spine, rolling my shoulders back, and expanding my chest. The broken old man evaporated, replaced instantly by the man who spent 40 years commanding construction sites and building steel towers across the Seattle skyline. I smoothed my suit jacket, stepped away from the wheelchair, and looked up at the bench. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand exactly where I am," I said. My voice did not waver. It was not the whisper of a confused senior citizen. It was a deep, resonant baritone booming across the quiet courtroom, with absolute clarity and undeniable authority. "I am standing in the King County Courthouse in the courtroom of the Honorable Eleanor Vance. Today is Thursday, and I am here to dismantle the most cruel financial fraud I have ever witnessed in my entire life." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Rachel recoiled as if she had been physically struck across the face. She scrambled backward, her chair scraping violently against the floor, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked as though she was staring at a ghost. Her senior corporate attorney dropped his gold pen, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He had built his entire emergency legal motion on the premise that I was practically a vegetable, and now the vegetable was commanding the room with the terrifying presence of a general. Judge Vance did not flinch, but her sharp eyes narrowed with intense focus. She leaned back in her high leather chair, clasping her hands together. "I am listening." "Mr. Harrison," she said softly. Her tone entirely changed. I nodded to Mitchell. My attorney reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed dossier stamped with a very different medical crest than the one Rachel had provided. I kept my eyes locked on the judge as I continued. "Your Honor, my daughter claimed to this court that my cognitive decline has been rapid and severe. She brought a corrupt private doctor into my home yesterday to certify that I could not remember the president or my own name. It was a magnificent performance on her part, and I played my role as the helpless victim quite well to ensure she would drag this conspiracy into the unforgiving light of your courtroom. But the truth is, my mind is completely intact." I gestured toward the document Mitchell handed to the bailiff. "A week ago, long before she ambushed me with a hospital bed in my living room, my attorney and I recognized the warning signs of her financial desperation. I quietly boarded a flight to Baltimore. I spent 3 exhaustive days at the Johns Hopkins Hospital Department of Neurology and Psychiatry. I underwent every cognitive, psychological, and neurological assessment known to modern medical science. I sat through grueling hours of memory tests, spatial reasoning exams, and brain scans. I wanted undeniable proof of my sanity gathered by the most respected medical institution in this country." The bailiff placed the heavy file on the bench. Judge Vance opened it, scanning the summary pages. I continued, letting my voice fill the room. "As you will see on the first page, Your Honor, the Chief of Neurology certified that my cognitive function, memory retention, and analytical reasoning are not simply normal. They are in the top 1% for my age demographic. I do not have Alzheimer's. I do not have dementia. I am fully capable of managing my business, my life, and my $7 million. I executed the trust transfer completely of my own volition to protect my life savings from the woman sitting at that table." Rachel let out a whimpering sound, burying her face in her hands. Her attorney looked as though he was going to be physically sick. He began sliding his files into his briefcase, desperately looking for an exit strategy from the catastrophic malpractice suit he was facing. Judge Vance finished reading the summary from Johns Hopkins. She lowered the file and picked up the fraudulent incapacity certificate signed by Dr. Thorne and Judge Caldwell. She looked between the two documents, the veins in her neck visibly pulsing with righteous fury. She glared at Rachel's attorney with a gaze so cold it could freeze water. "Counsel," she said, her voice dripping with dangerous venom, "it appears you have submitted a completely fabricated medical document to this court in a fraudulent attempt to seize a citizen's assets." The attorney stood up, his knees shaking. "Your Honor, I had absolutely no idea," he stammered defensively. "My client assured me the evaluation was entirely legitimate." Rachel looked up, her face streaked with tears, paralyzed by the destruction of her perfect plan. She thought the worst was over. She thought losing the money was her ultimate punishment. But I took a step closer to the bench, my posture rigid, my eyes burning with the cold justice of a father who had been pushed too far. I looked at the judge and I looked back at my daughter. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a steel blade, "we have definitively established that I am of perfectly sound mind. But I am not finished yet. The fraudulent conservatorship was only the final act of her desperate greed. Now I would like to show this court exactly why my daughter needed to steal $7 million from her own father in the first place." I turned slightly and gave Mitchell a single sharp nod. My attorney did not hesitate. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small black digital audio player. He approached the clerk desk and requested permission to connect the device to the courtroom internal speaker system. Judge Vance, her interest now entirely captivated by the unfolding spectacle, granted him immediate permission to proceed with the evidence. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft click of the audio cable snapping into the auxiliary port. The opposing attorney stood frozen, his hands hovering helplessly over his ruined legal files, completely unaware of the devastating blow that was about to be struck. Mitchell pressed a button, and a low static hiss filled the high-ceilinged room, followed by the echoing acoustics of a damp concrete parking garage. Then a voice broke through the speakers. It was a raw, trembling, and deeply broken voice that everyone in the room immediately recognized. It was Derek. Sitting in the second row of the gallery, my son-in-law lowered his head, his shoulders trembling, as his own desperate confession began to play for the judge. The recording captured the heavy rain falling outside the garage, and the sound of my own voice, sharp and demanding, asking why a decent man would help his wife send an innocent father to a psychiatric ward. And then came Derek's agonizing reply. His recorded voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, carrying the unbearable weight of a terrified father's profound sorrow. He confessed everything. He spoke about discovering the offshore accounts 6 months ago. He explained how he had threatened to expose her massive corporate embezzlement and file for a divorce to protect their family. But the most damning revelation was yet to come. Derek's voice cracked on the recording as he detailed Rachel's horrific retaliation. He explained the fake medical file she had purchased from Dr. Thorne, the completely fabricated report claiming Derek had been physically abusing their 5-year-old son. He sobbed as he recounted her cold, calculated promise. She had sworn that if he ever breathed a single word about the stolen company funds, or if he tried to leave the marriage, she would submit that report to Child Protective Services. She promised him he would go to prison for child abuse and never see his boy again. She had him in a vice, forcing his compliance through the absolute most wicked form of blackmail imaginable. As the recording played, I watched Rachel. The transformation was terrifying. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickening chalky white. Her eyes darted wildly toward the gallery, locking onto her husband. The realization that he had turned against her, that he had bravely provided the exact weapon I needed to destroy her, completely snapped whatever thin thread of sanity she had left. When the recording finished and the harsh static faded into silence, the courtroom felt as though the air had been sucked out of it. Judge Vance stared at the bench, her jaw set in a tight, furious line, utterly repulsed by the magnitude of the cruelty she had just heard. But Rachel did not wait for the judge to speak. With an animalistic shriek of pure, unbridled fury, she pushed her heavy wooden chair backward so violently that it crashed onto the polished mahogany floor. She lunged across the plaintiff table, her hands hooked like claws, completely ignoring her panicked attorney who tried to grab her arm. She charged directly toward the wooden railing that separated the legal tables from the public gallery, her eyes fixed entirely on Derek. She screamed his name, a guttural sound of absolute hatred and betrayal, determined to physically tear him apart right there in front of the judge. The two armed bailiffs stationed by the heavy oak doors reacted with lightning speed. Before Rachel could even reach the railing to grab her husband, they intercepted her. They caught her by the arms, their sheer physical weight and training easily overpowering her frantic thrashing momentum. She fought them wildly, kicking her expensive shoes against their heavy boots, twisting and screaming obscenities that echoed violently through the dignified halls of justice. Derek did not flinch. He sat straight up in his pew, looking back at the monster he had married, with a newfound, profound courage. He was finally free from her terrifying shadow. Realizing she could not reach him, Rachel desperately shifted her tactics. She turned her wildly thrashing head toward the high bench, her hair completely disheveled, her expensive corporate suit twisted and wrinkled in the grip of the bailiffs. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at Mitchell, her voice cracking as she screamed legal jargon she barely understood in her panicked state. She shrieked that the recording was a complete violation of her rights. She yelled that it was an illegal, unauthorized wiretap. She demanded the judge strike it from the official record, claiming that nobody had given their legal consent to be recorded in that dark parking garage, and therefore it could never be used against her in a court of law. Mitchell stood his ground. He did not raise his voice. He did not show any signs of intimidation. He calmly picked up his pen, twisted the cap, and placed it gently upon the wooden table. He looked at the desperately thrashing woman being restrained by the court officers, and a slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster watching his opponent realize they had walked directly into an unavoidable checkmate. He turned his attention back to the high bench, looking respectfully up at the stunned magistrate. Mitchell buttoned his immaculate charcoal suit jacket, straightened his posture, and delivered the final legal blow that would secure her total destruction. He spoke with absolute confidence. Washington is a two-party consent state, Your Honor. However, under the extortion exception, this is entirely admissible. Judge Vance held up a hand, her sharp gaze remaining locked on the struggling woman who was still fighting furiously against the unyielding grip of the armed court officers. The judge turned her attention back to Mitchell, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, uncompromising, judicial authority. She stated clearly that under the established legal statutes of the state, a recording made in the active commission of a felony extortion attempt was indeed fully admissible as concrete evidence. She overruled the desperate objection of the opposing counsel without a second thought. Hearing this definitive ruling, Rachel finally stopped thrashing. Her legs completely gave out beneath her, and the bailiffs had to physically support her entire weight to keep her from collapsing onto the polished hardwood floor. Her senior corporate attorney, recognizing instantly that his entire professional career was now in severe irreversible jeopardy, quietly closed his leather briefcase, stepped entirely away from the plaintiff table, and silently abandoned his client to her inevitable disastrous fate. But the absolute destruction of Rachel Harrison was not quite complete. Mitchell did not return to his seat. He reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with dark red wax and bearing the unmistakable, intimidating official insignia of the Department of Justice. The courtroom fell so completely silent that you could hear the heavy rain lashing violently against the high, stained glass windows. Mitchell walked slowly and deliberately toward the bench, handing the sealed envelope directly to the bailiff, who then passed it carefully up to the judge. Mitchell turned slightly, making absolutely sure his voice carried to every single corner of the room, ensuring Rachel heard every single word of her impending doom. He announced that earlier this week, when his client first discovered the massive financial irregularities and the forged power of attorney, They did not simply secure the remaining liquid assets and wait. They immediately contacted the highest levels of the federal authorities. Mitchell explained that they had provided the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission with a comprehensive, meticulously documented dossier. This extensive dossier contained undeniable proof of the $2.5 million Rachel had fraudulently extracted from her father's commercial real estate properties. It also contained the offshore routing numbers and the internal ledger discrepancies, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had been actively embezzling from her corporate employer for over 2 years. Judge Vance broke the red wax seal and opened the heavy envelope. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on official federal letterhead. The room watched in stunned, breathless silence as her eyes scanned the top page of the comprehensive criminal filing. Her face, usually a picture of stoic neutrality, turned to absolute stone. The lines around her mouth tightened severely, and her knuckles turned entirely white as she gripped the edges of the paper. Mitchell continued speaking, his voice ringing like a somber funeral bell. He stated that the document the judge was currently reading was not a simple criminal complaint or an investigation request. It was an active, signed, and fully executed federal indictment. The authorities had already reviewed the overwhelming financial evidence, corroborated the forged signatures on the mortgage documents, and confirmed the massive deficit in the corporate accounts of her tech startup. I watched my daughter as the reality of her inescapable situation finally crushed the last remaining breath from her lungs. The arrogant, untouchable corporate executive was completely gone. In her place stood a broken, terrified criminal who had gambled everything on a heartless betrayal and lost spectacularly. She had tried to put her own father into a psychiatric prison to save herself from federal prosecution. Instead, her unbridled greed had simply handed the federal prosecutors the final pieces of evidence they desperately needed to lock her away for decades. She looked at me, her eyes pleading silently for a mercy she did not deserve and had never shown to me. I did not blink. I did not look away. I simply stared back at her with the cold, unyielding judgment of a man who had survived her absolute best attempt to destroy his life. Judge Vance slowly lowered the federal indictment and placed it carefully upon the heavy wooden desk. She took a deep breath, looking out over the silent courtroom, her gaze finally resting on the trembling woman. The judge spoke with a quiet, terrifying intensity that commanded absolute submission from everyone present in the massive room. She declared that in all her years sitting on the state bench, she had never witnessed a more calculated, malicious, and entirely reprehensible abuse of the legal and medical systems. She stated that Rachel had attempted to use the very court, designed to protect the vulnerable, as a weapon to execute a massive financial crime against her own flesh and blood. The judge picked up the wooden gavel. She declared that the emergency motion to freeze the assets of Richard Harrison was immediately and permanently denied. She formally and completely dissolved the fraudulent conservatorship granted by the corrupt private judge the evening before, restoring my full legal rights and absolute independence. Then Judge Vance shifted her piercing gaze to the 2 armed bailiffs who were still holding Rachel by the arms. She raised the heavy wooden gavel high into the air. The crack of the wood hitting the sounding block echoed through the cavernous courtroom like a solitary rifle shot, sealing the fate of the woman who had tried to bury me alive. "Take Ms. Harrison into custody," the judge ordered, her voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "You will hold her without bail, pending federal transfer for the charges of massive financial forgery, felony extortion, and aggravated perjury." The 2 armed court officers did not hesitate for a single second. The moment Judge Vance delivered her final devastating order, they moved with practiced clinical efficiency. One bailiff firmly gripped Rachel by her left arm, while the other reached around her back, forcing her hands together. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed through the cavernous courtroom. It was a cold, unforgiving sound, the definitive sound of absolute ruin. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life commanding boardrooms, manipulating financial markets, and dictating the lives of everyone around her. The physical restriction of those steel chains broke whatever fragile illusions she had left. She was no longer a powerful corporate executive holding the strings of an elaborate conspiracy. She was just another common criminal standing before a judge. She tried to pull away her expensive silk blouse, tearing slightly at the shoulder, but the officers held her with an iron grip. The gallery remained completely silent, watching the spectacular downfall of a predator who had finally been caught in her own trap. The reality of her immediate incarceration finally washed over her, stripping away her anger and leaving only a raw, pathetic desperation. She looked wildly around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face. She looked toward the plaintiff table, but her senior attorney had already packed his leather briefcase and was swiftly walking down the center aisle, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of her crimes. She turned her tear-streaked face toward the gallery, her eyes frantically seeking out the man she had tormented for years. Derek stood in the second row, his posture completely relaxed for the first time in what must have been months. He did not look at her with anger, nor did he look at her with pity. He looked at her with the peaceful, detached resignation of a man who had just awoken from a terrible nightmare. He turned his back on her, picked up his coat, and walked quietly toward the exit. He was going home to his son. He was going to start a new life entirely free from her toxic shadow. Seeing her husband walk away, realizing that her corporate career was annihilated and her freedom was gone, Rachel turned her frantic gaze back to the defense table. She looked directly at me. The woman who had proudly patted my head and treated me like a broken animal just 24 hours ago was now begging for her life. She strained against the heavy grip of the bailiffs, leaning her body toward me, tears streaming down her ruined face. "Dad!" She cried out, her voice a shrill, agonizing wail that scraped against the high ceilings of the courthouse. "Dad, please! You cannot let them do this to me. You have to stop them. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, I am your daughter. I am your blood. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to a federal prison. Please, Daddy, I am so sorry." Her pleas were desperate, pathetic, and entirely hollow. She was not sorry for what she had done to me, nor was she sorry for what she had done to Derek or her own son. She was only sorry that she had finally been caught. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the sudden, agonizing heartbreak that a father is supposed to feel when watching his child being dragged away in chains. I had already mourned the loss of my daughter. I had mourned her during those long, dark nights lying in that mechanical hospital bed, listening to her scheme and plot my demise. I had grieved for the little girl I used to know, the one who rode her bicycle in the driveway and fell asleep on my chest. That girl was gone, replaced by a ruthless, greedy stranger who viewed my life as nothing more than an obstacle to her own wealth. She had methodically planned to falsely lock me away in a completely cold, incredibly sterile, terrifying psychiatric facility, fully prepared to let me wither and die in absolute isolation, just so she could effortlessly maintain her incredibly lavish lifestyle and escape the very severe legal consequences of her own disastrous corporate financial actions. I placed my hands flat on the polished wooden table and pushed myself up from the heavy chair. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, projecting the quiet, unyielding strength of a man who had weathered the storm. I took a slow, deliberate breath, reached up with my calloused hands, and carefully straightened the lapels of my charcoal suit jacket. I looked down at her, locking my eyes with hers, ensuring that my final words would burn themselves permanently into her memory. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any warmth, anger, or sorrow. It was the absolute chilling tone of a final verdict. "My daughter died the moment you tried to put a price tag on my freedom," I said, my words cutting through her hysterical sobs like a sharp knife. "You are just a thief in an expensive suit, and today you are finally going to pay your debts." I did not wait for her response. I did not want to hear another single word fall from her deceitful lips. I turned away from the plaintiff table, nodding once to Mitchell, who was quietly packing his files. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my footsteps echoing with a steady, confident rhythm against the hardwood floor. Behind me, Rachel began to scream a wild, wordless sound of absolute despair as the bailiffs physically dragged her toward the holding cells. I pushed open the heavy brass-studded oak doors of the courtroom. I stepped out into the quiet, brightly lit corridor, and the heavy doors swung shut behind me with a solid, echoing thud, cutting off her screams completely and closing that dark chapter of my life forever. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom closing behind me marked the definitive end of the most turbulent week of my life. The air outside the courthouse felt crisp, clean, and completely free of the suffocating tension that had gripped my chest for days. It has been exactly 6 months since that gray Thursday morning in Seattle, and the profound changes in my life have been nothing short of extraordinary. The very first thing I did upon returning to my house was hire a local disposal company to dismantle that mechanical hospital bed. I watched with immense satisfaction as they carried the heavy steel frame out of my front door and loaded it into the back of a garbage truck. I thoroughly scrubbed the floors, opened every single window to let the fresh breeze sweep away the sterile institutional smell, and moved my beautiful leather sofas back into their rightful place by the stone fireplace. My sanctuary was finally mine again. With the immediate physical threat removed, Mitchell and I turned our focused attention to the financial wreckage Rachel had left in her wake. The irrevocable trust which had served as an impenetrable shield against her greed now became the very tool I used to rebuild my foundation. Working closely with the trust administrators, I authorized the release of the necessary capital to completely pay off the predatory balloon mortgages she had secretly taken out against my 3 commercial warehouses. It took weeks of aggressive legal maneuvering by Mitchell to navigate the complex fraudulent loans, but we ultimately cleared the titles. The buildings I had poured my blood and sweat into for 2 decades were completely secure, continuing to generate the steady, passive income I had always intended to leave for my grandson. But the most significant battle fought over these past 6 months was not for money or real estate. It was the brutal, emotionally devastating war for my grandson. Rachel did not surrender quietly. Even from her federal holding cell, she fought bitterly to retain custody of her child, attempting to use the same vicious manipulation tactics that had ultimately destroyed her career. But Derek was no longer the terrified, silent man sitting in the shadows of a parking garage. With my absolute unwavering support, he filed for a comprehensive divorce and demanded full, unmitigated custody of the boy. I did not simply offer him emotional support. I used the vast resources of my trust to hire the most ruthless, effective family law attorneys in the entire state of Washington. I financed a legal strike force that systematically dismantled every single lie Rachel attempted to introduce into the family court system. We presented the audio recording of her horrific extortion attempt. We presented the fabricated medical reports she had purchased from Dr. Thorne, who was now also facing his own severe criminal indictments alongside Judge Caldwell. The family court judge was absolutely appalled by the depths of her depravity. The ruling was swift and completely decisive. Derek was awarded sole legal and physical custody of his son, and Rachel was permanently stripped of all her parental rights. Shortly after the custody trial concluded, the federal government officially sentenced my former daughter to 12 years in a maximum security penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and perjury. She will spend the next decade of her life locked inside a concrete cell, a fitting environment for a woman who had tried to lock her own father away in a psychiatric ward. The silence in my home is no longer a heavy, oppressive burden. It is filled with the joyous, energetic laughter of a 5-year-old boy running across the hardwood floors. Derek and my grandson moved into the house with me shortly after the divorce was finalized. We converted Rachel's old childhood bedroom into a bright, colorful playroom. Every evening when Derek returns home from his new job, we sit together on the porch watching the sunset over the Seattle skyline. We talk about the future, we share our quiet moments, and we watch the boy play in the yard. Derek is no longer just a son-in-law to me. The shared trauma we endured and the fierce battle we fought side by side to protect our family forged a bond between us that is stronger than any biological tie. He proved his character when he risked his own safety to call me on my birthday. He stood up to a monster to protect his child. He is a man of profound integrity, immense courage, and deep compassion. He is in every single way that truly matters, the absolute son I never had. I look at him and I see the exact kind of man I am proud to call my family. This entire agonizing ordeal taught me a profound lesson that I will carry with me for the rest of my natural days on this earth. We are frequently conditioned by society to blindly believe that we must endure endless abuse, constant manipulation, and deep disrespect simply because the cruel person inflicting the pain happens to share our genetic makeup. People will often tell you that you must always forgive your relatives, no matter how terribly they treat you. But true family is built on a solid foundation of mutual trust, unwavering support, and genuine unconditional love. It is never built on a terrifying foundation of fear and financial greed. Sometimes, the most courageous and necessary thing a person can ever do is simply walk away from the toxic people you thought you were supposed to love. You do this to finally discover the truly wonderful people who genuinely value your precious life. Blood doesn't make a family. Loyalty and respect do. If you've ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life to survive, let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories, and don't forget to leave a super thanks if this story gave you the courage to stand up for yourself.